And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the sea. Peace, be still. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. You may be seated. A few weeks ago, when we were coming back from vacation in Colorado, it was right when we were going through New Mexico, and before we got to the Texas border, we went through one of the worst storms that I think I've ever driven through in my entire life. The wind was blowing the car all over the place. The rain and hail were not hitting the windshield, but were entirely hitting the side of the car. The wind was so strong. And then, to make matters worse, suddenly, the rain and the hail were hitting the other side of the car. And I wanted to say either we turned around and went the other direction without knowing it, or the storm did. I don't know which is the case, because I can't see either way. But I'm sure that all of us have been driven through a bad storm, or through bad traffic, or something along those lines. But whenever we do, we all tend to do the same thing. Whatever was playing on the radio suddenly gets turned off. Whatever songs the kids were singing are suddenly hushed, and Dad has to focus on the road. Well, I think there's a parable in this for life. I think that we have taught ourselves a wise spiritual lesson by what we tend to do in the car. And I think that the gospel today will elucidate for us what exactly that lesson is. But first off, St. Mark begins with a story. He says this: a great storm of wind arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. Now, we all go through spiritual storms and trials, don't we? The boat that we experience that gets rocked in our own life gets rocked by the storms and the winds and the waves of life. We've all been through these experiences, haven't we? We've all experienced the rain of life. We've all experienced it when our boat begins to take on water. We've all experienced it when we felt as if, Lord, there isn't too much more that I can take. This is an experience that's common to each and every one of us. We all go through the storms of life. And we all know what it's like to allow that storm outside of us to begin to seep into our soul. No longer is the storm just out there, but suddenly the waves aren't just hitting against the side of the ship, but they're coming into it. The storm isn't just a storm of clouds and rain and sea, but the storm is a storm of the heart. A storm within us. A storm that we can't seem to stop, and a storm that seems as if it will overtake us. And don't forget this little detail that St. Mark adds as well, where he says this short little phrase, and other boats were there with them. Anytime we go through the storms of life, it's never just us by ourselves. But what tends to happen is we also tend to drag others through our storm, too, don't we? Suddenly we have a bad day, and then we make someone else have a bad day, who then makes someone else have a bad day. And suddenly we create a culture of bad days around us because of the storm that we ourselves are dealing with. I was reminded of this yesterday. Excuse me. We drove home from Dallas the other day, and just last night. Of course, we were getting in late. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and I was all stressed out because, of course, I've been driving in the car, and it had been a long day, and I've got to be up early the next day. The kids have to be up early the next day. They're past their bedtime by 2 hours. And Eli asks me a simple little question at 10 p.m. at night. The cute little kid goes, "Can I have some ice cream?" And so I, all stressed out, I lose my patience, and suddenly I raise my voice. And then the poor little kid's unhappy and crying. It's all my fault. And I feel terrible about it. But it was a reminder to me of exactly what I'm preaching about this morning. That what happens is the storm around us becomes a storm within us. And when that happens, we become a storm to other people. And it can spread, and it can spread, and it can spread. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what do we do with these storms? How do we keep ourselves from becoming a storm for somebody else? How do we keep the storm from seeping into our souls and becoming a storm within our heart? How do we learn to discover peace within the midst of the storm? I think St. Mark gives us an answer to that very question. He continues in the next verse where he says, "But he," referring to Jesus, "was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we perish?'" Isn't this a question that all of us ask God when those terrible storms of life begin to come on around us? When we begin to take on water, when we begin to think we can't take this too much longer, we ask God that very question. Where are you? What are you doing? Why aren't you calming the storm that's around me? Don't you see that I'm about to sink? Do you not care that I'm about to perish? But do you see what was happening with the apostles? I think there's an important lesson in this as we gaze upon Jesus Christ sleeping in the midst of this storm. Jesus Christ was himself experiencing a peace that seemed unattainable for the disciples. And as the disciples looked out at the storm, all they could see was the storm. They allowed that storm to determine what was happening inside of their boat. And they never realized that despite the lack of peace outside of them, peace himself was sleeping right there in their boat. Peace himself was within the boat. And don't we all tend to do the same exact thing? We tend to focus on all the bad things. We tend to focus on the storms, and the storm begins to define the way we look at our world, the way we look at our life, the way we look at other people, the way that we look at ourselves. And we fail to realize that true peace is already inside of our souls, inside of our hearts, inside of us. I've always said that fear is nothing more than a poor estimation of God's goodness. Now note what I said there. I didn't say that it's a poor estimation of God's power. I don't think power has very much to do with it. I said it's a poor estimation of God's goodness. Look at what Jesus says about the disciples. Later on he says, "Why were you afraid? Have you no faith?" I think we tend to look at this and think to ourselves, well, what he means by that is that they should have known that the boat would never have sunk with Jesus in it. But I think we need to push that interpretation away. I think we need to remind ourselves that these were seasoned sailors. They knew when a boat was in danger. They knew quite well when a boat could capsize and sink. They knew quite well that once it took on so much water that it would go under. And they, being seasoned sailors, knew that that moment was right before them. But yet Jesus sleeps in the stern. The answer is that yes, bad things happen. Yes, the boat can sink. But right there within the boat is goodness itself. A goodness that transcends the storm. A goodness that is beyond and above the storm. A goodness that even a sinking boat can't lose for you. A goodness that holds you for all eternity. That transcends and goes beyond any temporary problem that you could ever experience. And the task for each and every one of us is to get our minds beyond the storm and find the peace within the boat. Grasp hold of the goodness that is there within us. Grasp hold of Jesus Christ. Learn the parable of the car in the storm. Learn to turn off the radio. Learn to quiet the noise. And learn to quiet and find the peace within so that you can deal with the storm that is without. And that is why we move on to the next verse. It says, "And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the sea. Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm." The question for each of us today is this: will you allow Jesus Christ, peace himself, goodness himself, to stand up in the boat and say, "Peace, be still," to the raging storms within your heart? Because note, the disciples had to find the peace within the boat before peace was established outside of the boat. And the same is true in our very lives. We must learn to find Jesus Christ within our hearts. We must learn to establish that quiet and empty space in our souls. Because Jesus Christ was able to establish peace within the boat first, and then establish order outside of the boat. And I think the same thing can be true for our own lives. I would love to see a movie made of this passage, or a portion of a movie. And if I were to do that, I would really accentuate the order of things. Once Jesus woke up, I would want to emphasize and maybe, find some way cinematically to have this peace take over the boat for just a couple of seconds, even while the storm continues to rage outside of it. Because I believe that's the proper order of things. And I believe each and every one of us are called today, despite the storms that are raging outside of us, to grasp hold of the goodness of God. To grasp hold of the eternal goodness, the strong foundation, the solid rock that does not move despite the raging wind, despite the raging waves. And when the storm ends, my friend, that rock will remain as strong as ever. And it was there the whole time. Let us establish our spiritual foundation on Jesus Christ. Let us allow him to speak peace into our souls. Let's turn off the radio of the car and get focused on the silence. Let us hear him say, "Peace, be still." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.